subject of denying self. And in lesson 1, we looked at pretty much defining what that means. What does it mean to deny self? And we looked at several verses and saw that we see the word deny self, the word self-control, and the word temperance are the 3 words or the 3 phrases that we find in the scriptures. And we looked at the definitions as they are defined from the original Greek word. We hopefully went away with our study of lesson 1, at least having an understanding of what it is that we're talking about when we read verses that talks about denying self or exercising temperance. In our study tonight, we're looking at a lesson that helps us to see that God demands self-denial. So self-denial is not just a suggestion, by no means. It's not just simply a suggestion in order for us to have a better life. It is a command of the Lord. So I hope we understand the significance that that makes concerning the subject that we're studying. It's not a suggestion, it's not an option, it's a command. And so as Christians, we need to always concern ourselves with the things that we're commanded to do. The requirement for self-denial is something that's found in more passages of scriptures than I think we sometimes realize. In fact, to really understand what I mean by that is self-denial is affirmed on nearly every page of the Bible. That's the type of subject that we're studying here. So let's look at some of the passages that require self-denial. And first of all, let's look at some passages that specifically mentions self-denial or self-control. We looked at our opening verse last week in lesson 1 with Mark 8 and verse 34, and just almost always, whenever you find a verse of scripture in the Gospels, there are also other Gospels that have parallels to that verse. And that's what we want to start out with. Jesus said that those desiring to be his disciples must deny himself. We see that in Matthew 16, verse 24. Stephen, read that for us.
Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
All right. There we have Matthew's account. Then this is the account that we started off our study with last week, the statement found in Mark chapter 8 and verse 34, Glenn.
He had called the people to himself with his disciples also. He said to them, whoever desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me.
All right, so we're familiar with that verse, but we're seeing Matthew's account, and now we want to look at Luke's account. In Luke chapter 9 and verse 23, Brother Deb.
He said to them all, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me.
All right, so at least 3 out of the 4 Gospels, we have a parallel of that statement that Jesus made in what we're focusing our study on. So Jesus says it very clearly. If we are going to be a disciple, and we know what a disciple is a follower. A disciple is a learner. That's the basic definition of the word disciple. But we're talking about being a disciple in a very specific way, and that is a disciple of the Lord. Remember, they were disciples of Moses, they were disciples of the Pharisees. There are many things that people can follow, people can be learners of. But as Christians bearing the name, we need to be concerned with being a learner, a follower of Christ, his disciple. So Jesus makes it very plainly that we cannot be a follower, a learner, unless we deny self. So that's what we're studying, and that's what we're hoping to see how important. Now that we know what self-denial is, I want us to see how important it is from the standpoint of the fact that God demands it, and just take a consideration of just a few of the many scriptures that deal with this very thing. In fact, when Paul preached to Felix, he preached about righteousness, and as a word, temperance, and judgment to come in Acts 24 and verse 25. David?
Now, he reasoned about righteousness, self-control, judgment to come. We like to answer.
And we know what the next verse says, don't we? Go thy way for now. When I have a more convenient season, I'll call for you. But we know that from all indication, at least from the scriptures, that convenient moment never did occur. But that's what he reasoned with Felix concerning righteousness, which we know are God's commandments. All of God's commandments are righteousness, self-control, and certainly most folks in positions of power and influence like Felix certainly needed a good dose of self-control and to make them aware of a day of accounting, the judgment that's to come. But yet we see in the preaching that Paul did, he taught about temperance, self-denial, self-control. And Peter lists temperance as one of those things that we often refer to as the Christian graces, which we are told starts off by adding these things to our faith. And the verse that specifically points out that part is in verse 6. So, Brother Lee, read that for us.
Knowledge, self-control, perseverance, godliness.
All right. And we'll be looking at verses 5 through 10 a little bit later in our study. But that is the verse that specifically mentions and helps us to see how that truly the passages in the scriptures that do specifically mention self-control or perseverance. And then even the fruit of the Spirit includes self-control. In Galatians 5, verse 23, okay?
Gentleness, self-control, against such there is no law.
All right. So there we have it. Even the fruit of the Spirit, self-control, is in that list. And we're told that those that run the race and compete for the crown, they must be temperate in all things. 1 Corinthians 9 and verse 25. Dylan?
And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Now they do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we for an imperishable crown.
All right. While we're on this point, the comparison of what Paul is making in this statement is that we are to be self-controlled, self-disciplined, just as athletes are. Athletes have willpower and persistence that keep their minds focused, and they make themselves do what they do not otherwise want to do. A lot of restrictions, a lot of things that they are forced themselves to do, knowing that these are the things that will help to make them competitive, that these are the things that will give them an edge over the competition. And so we know in the Hebrew letter that the life of a Christian is described as a race. Let us run the race that is set before us. in Hebrew chapter 13 or Hebrew chapter 12. So, yes, we're in a race, and as temperance is so important to an athlete, we need to understand, like what Paul is saying here, that truly temperance is to be important to us. It's the only thing that's going to help us to endure the race, and it's the only thing that's going to help us to get us to the end of the race. And we know that elders, they are to have self-control. Titus 1 and verse 8, Bill?
Hospitable, a lover of what is good, sober-minded, just, holy, and self-controlled.
All right. So their qualifications includes self-control. And then while we're here in Titus, even says the aged men should be temperate. Titus 2 and verse 2. But see it?
But the older man be sober, reverent, temperate, sound in faith, and love and patience.
All right, so our word here is temperate. Remember we said in our first lesson, deny self, self-control, temperate or temperance are the words that all are used to understood to be what we're talking about in denying self. So here are those verses that specifically mention self-control, self-denial. Now let's look at some passages that deal with self-denial, self-control in principle. We recall that Paul, excuse me, Paul urged the Romans not to continue in sin. Romans 6 and verse 1, Brother White.
What shall we say then? Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound?
All right. What should we say then? Shall we continue in sin? And of course, we know the answer. He goes on and gives it in verse 2. No. And so, by telling them not to let sin reign in their bodies, as we see in Romans chapter 6 and verse 12. Tim, read that one.
Therefore, do not let sin reign in your mortal body, that you should obey it in its lusts.
All right, now, if we are not to continue in sin, if we're not to let sin reign in our mortal bodies, the word temperance, the word self-control, the word deny self is not in those verses. Not specifically. But how else are we going to do what those verses are saying without denying self? How are we going to not continue in sin? How are we not going to continue to let sin reign if we're not exercising self-control? So that's what I mean by here, verses that the word's not found, but it's obvious that these are commands that can't be accomplished without self-control. So these verses, though the words ain't mentioned, these verses require self-control in order for us to do as Paul urges the Romans and as well as us to do. And he also said that it was no longer himself, but it was Christ that lived in him. Galatians 2 and verse 20. Brother Philip?
I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. And the life now which I live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me.
All right, we hear that, and we've read those verses, or that verse, many times, I'm sure. But look at it again. He said, I've been crucified with Christ. It's no longer I who live. Christ lives in me. The life that I now live, I live by faith in the Son of God. So Paul had said no to himself. And is that not what we talked about last week that is involved in denying self? You know, we said it's hard to say no to other people. It's harder to say no to ourselves. Well, here is Paul essentially saying no to himself. Those who are God's people willingly submit to Christ in everything. And that's what we're reading here in the passages that we've just read. In Ephesians 5, verse 24, Brother Donnie.
Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything.
All right. So here's a relationship, the husband and wife relationship that's being used, which is familiar, to explain the relationship between Christ and the church. The relationship of Christ and the church was a mystery. Well, the mystery is better understood when it's compared or stood up with something that's familiar. And the marriage relationship is familiar, husband and wife, and the relationship between the two. So, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. So again, what does that do? That implies self-denial. It implies self-denial on the part of the church, being in subjection to Christ. It involves self-denial on the part of the wife in subjection to her husband. But the words are not there. But is there not an emptying of self? Is there not a saying no to self in order to be subject to Christ? Surely there is. In the same sense that there is an emptying of self in order for the wife to be in subjection to her husband. So it must involve self-denial. Another thing about this aspect of our study, any passages that forbids something, just as sure as you read a verse that is forbidding something to be done, let us understand we're talking about self-denial. Lust, for instance, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 22. Shane?
Flee also youthful lust, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart.
How do we do that without denying self? We can't, and we won't. If we don't deny self, we'll go headlong into youthful lust. Another verse, Matthew 5, verse 28. Rod?
But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
All right. Don't all of us men realize that it takes self-control to turn our eyes away? It don't take no self-control to continue to look. It takes self-control to turn our eyes away and then to focus our minds on something else. Change our mind, get our minds on something else. Self-control. We have to be in control, or else we will do the very thing that Jesus says will happen. We will lust after her, we will commit adultery with her in our hearts. Self-control, self-denial. So it's not mentioned, but these things can't be accomplished without What about lying? Look in Ephesians 4, verse 25. Rex?
Therefore, putting away lying, let each one of you speak truth with his neighbor, for we are members one of another.
Does it take self-control to not lie and tell the truth? You better believe it does. It takes a lot of self-control, especially if telling a lie will get us out of a bad spot. Especially if telling a lie will keep us from being embarrassed. It takes self-control to tell the truth.
I think that sometimes we have to be very careful with our speech not to tell something's wrong, not intentionally, but even more so.
Yeah. Very true. Self-control. We have to have it in order to speak the truth and lie not. Immorality. Big word, broad word. In 1 Corinthians 16:18, Rodney?
Flee fornication. Every sin that a man does is outside the body, but he who commits sexual immorality sins against his own body.
All right. Flee fornication. We just read a moment ago, flee also youthful lust. Flee fornication. And we're told here that every sin that a man does is outside the body, but when we commit fornication, we sin against our own body. But the thing about fornication also is when it says every man that does so, every time, every sin that a man does, let's say this, every sin that a man does, every sin that a person does, male or female, is because we lack self-control. We fail to deny self. Why do we sin? Because we choose to. Whatever the reason that we may use to justify sin, it's always going to be a choice. And every time we make the choice to sin, we have failed to deny self. We have failed to say no to self. That's why we said last week, depending on the sin, some sins are easier to say no to than others, and that varies among the person that we are. You know, for you to say no to this sin, I may not have any problem saying no to. You may have a great deal of a problem. But still, it's all a matter of denying self. Whether it's something that we have difficulty doing or whether it's something that we don't. Every sin is a choice. Nobody makes us sin. We choose to sin. And when we do, it's because we have failed to say no to self. We have failed to deny self. Then there's covetousness. Colossians 3 and verse 5. And we'll go back over to Stephen.
Therefore, put to death your members which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry.
And you know, these verses like this verse that includes a number of other things. It's not just covetousness in this verse that requires self-denial to not commit every one of those other sins. They require, but we had to pick certain things. And so Colossians 3 and verse 5 helps us to see that covetousness, that is the desire, the unhealthy, the overdoing of the desire to have things, is covetousness. It's idolatry. It turns into idolatry because these are the things that are the most important to us. These are the things that we devote most of our time, most of our attention. These are things that are first with us. So that's why Paul says covetousness, it's idolatry. But also is all these other things, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, all these things require self-control. And revenge. You don't think that requires self-control? Sure it does. Romans 12, verses 17 through 21. Brother Glenn?
Repay, I'm not gonna do it. That's too much.
Do what?
I can't do it.
You can't do it? Can you see it, Brother Deb? Okay, let me read it for you. Repay no one evil for evil. Have regard for good things in the sight of all men. If it's possible, as much as depends on you, live peaceably with all men. Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Therefore, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him a drink. For in so doing, you will heap coals of fire on his head. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. To return evil for evil, that requires self-control. And as I said, with some of us, it requires a whole lot more than it does with others. But I think to a certain degree, all of us has that little bit of a tendency in us to want to get even when we have been said something against, mistreated, whatever. So here's an area where definitely the words ain't mentioned, but there's no way that we can let God have the vengeance and not take it ourselves without self-control, without saying no to ourselves, because there's such a tendency, such a desire on certain things that happen that we want to take matters in our own hands and get the matter straight, but not so. Laziness, Romans 12, verse 11. Can you read that one?
Not lagging in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord.
All right. Not lagging in diligence. We know diligence is desire. It's the drive, it's the force that we need to have. Well, let's not lag. And that is just another way of saying, let's don't be lazy in our service as a Christian. Let's be diligent, not half-hearted, not just lackadaisy, but be diligent, fervent, zealous, with zeal. Let's serve the Lord, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. So laziness is something that if we're not careful, it's easy for us to not say no to ourselves and give in. And another one, 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10, Brother Deb.
2 Thessalonians 3:10. Even when we were reading, we commanded you this: if anyone will not work, neither shall he eat.
All right. So here again, we see the need for denying self. It's easy when we can be in a position, and sad to say, we're in a position in this country where that we are really in a welfare state for the most part. And when you have things that because of government programs, federal, state, local, whatever, that tend to pay you money to stay at home when if you went out to work, you would probably not make as much, what's the tendency? The tendency is to be lazy. The tendency is not to work. That's where you have to deny self. And there are other things that are involved too. You know, you would think that a person in that position would have a little bit of integrity about themselves. But, you know, integrity, shame, and those kind of qualities are fast fading in our society today. But laziness is something that we have to contend with and say no to ourselves, although it can be very tempting at times. And to be self-willed. This is spoken about in Titus 1 and verse 7. David?
For bishop must be blameless as a steward of God, not self-willed, not quick-tempered, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money.
All right. So again, talking about qualifications, we see they're not to be self-willed. And that pretty much is an exact opposite of denying self. That's always putting self first. The opposite of denying self. And one other one, and we'll let that suffice, is hatred. In Galatians 5, verse 20, Brother George.
Idolatry, sorcery, hatred, contention, jealousy, outbursts of wrath, self-salvation, dissension, heresies.
So again, another one of those verses that has a number of things that are mentioned. And while we're just picking out hatred, we could go back to verse 19 and read all the way up to verse 21. We're talking about the works of the flesh, and every one of those works of the flesh involve denying self, or we're going to be guilty. So any passage that forbids, like we've looked at, lust, lying, immorality, covetousness, revenge, laziness, self-willed, hatred, these are things that we're commanded not to do. And just as sure as we see a command of that nature, we know we're talking about something that's going to require denying self on our part in order to be able to obey those commands. Now, too, any passage that commands, not just like we looked at, we're commanded not to do them. These are things that we're commanded to do. Those things that we're commanded to do require self-control, meekness. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5, okay?
Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth.
So here's something we're to do. And you know, there's always a lot of questions about really what is meekness. A lot of people think of meekness as weakness. You know, if you're meek, you're weak. But that's not the definition of meekness. There are two people in the scriptures that are specifically stated that they were meek. Anybody know who they were? Moses. Okay. And Moses, if you're taking notes, that's in Numbers 12 and verse 3. There was not a meeker man on the face of the earth than Moses. Was he weak? Not by a long shot. Look at what all Moses went through. We know he made that sin in Numbers 20. But think of all of the other things that Moses endured. No, meekness is not weakness. The best definition that I know to give for meekness is moral courage. That's meekness. To have the courage to do what's right. And who was the other one? Oh, no. Christ. Remember? Remember there in Matthew 11 and verse 29? Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. Was Jesus weak? No. No, Jesus had courage. He had moral courage to to stand up for what was right. So, meekness is something that we're commanded. And it's going to require denying self, a lot of self-control, to have moral courage, to stand and do what's the right thing to do. Then there's gentleness, 2 Timothy 2 and verse 24. Dylan?
And the servant of the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, patient.
All right. Gentleness. Command. Some of us will have a little harder time being gentle than others. But it's going to take a degree of denying self, wherever we are, as a person and as a character, when it comes to being able to be gentle. Then there's patience. We saw that in the verse that we just read. So that the Lord must not quarrel, but be gentle to all, able to teach, and to be patient. And again, here's one of those things that it seems that some people have a lot of patience, and then some people don't seem to have very much. But either way, it takes a person with denying self to be patient. Some of us have to work on that a little harder than others. And then soberness. And let's understand, we're not talking about something that we're under the influence of intoxicating drink. That's not the soberness that we read about in the scriptures. In 1 Peter 1 and verse 13, Bill? Okay. Sid?
Therefore, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober, and rest your hope fully upon the grace that is to be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ.
Really, we're told here in this verse, we see a definition to a degree of sober. It has to do, you're kidding. It has to do with the mind. See, gird up the loins of your mind, be sober. So again, we're not talking about intoxicated. We're talking about being clear in our thinking, clear with what it is that the decision that we're going to make, and clear in understanding what's going to be the consequences. That's sober, serious in our thinking. Then there's contentment. And boy, that's a good one. Hebrews 13 verse 5. Brother White?
Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you.
Here again is one of those things we're commanded to do, and some of us have a harder time with it than others. But you know, it's interesting, and the verse don't come to my mind right now, but Paul said, in whatsoever state I'm in, I have learned to be content. So see, contentment is not something that's automatic to any of us. It's like we have to be like Paul. We have to learn to be content. And so he says here, let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. And that's what Paul goes on and says, that having food and raiment, let us therewith be content. And he goes through a number of things of how he's abounded and he's suffered loss. And, you know, back and forth, the pendulum has swung in Paul's life. So he learned to be content. But again, it took self-denial, self-control on Paul's part, and it will take it on our part. And then chastity. Titus 2 and verse 5, Brother Tim.
Be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God may not be blasphemed.
All right. Again, all of the things that are mentioned in this verse, they all require self-denial. But we just picked the one, and that is chastity. And that seems, again, to be a virtue that society today is in great need of. So, see, the fact is, when you think about it, any passage that forbids anything and any passage that commands anything teaches self-denial. So that's why I go back to what I said at the very beginning of our study. It's amazing how much self-denial is used in the scriptures, and then how that on almost every page of the Bible, self-denial is implied. Because whether we have a command to not do something or we have a command to do something, it's going to require self-control, self-denial. So let's not go into Roman numeral 2, as time is about a minute away. And let me go ahead and pass out lesson 3 in case we get that far. Of course, it'll be a couple of weeks before we get back to our study, but at least you'll have